Hello, I'm your host Jim McLean. Welcome to the latest episode of the Banterflix movie review show. Let's see what we'll be talking about tonight. This week we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man with a show dedicated to the live-action outings for Stan Lee's and Steve Ditko's iconic creation. So that's what we've lined up for you this week with a Spider-Man special. Yes, the guy that talks about comic book fatigue is having an episode dedicated entirely to the web slinger. I can't talk about it alone, so joining me this week is local cosplayer and huge Spider-Man fan, Aoibheann.
Hiya.
And we need a comic book guru. That is not throwing shade on you, Aoibheann, but we usually have you on the podcast on our Comic Book 101s, but Aaron Flanagan from the Comic Book Guys.
Hi, Jim.
So we have a show dedicated to all things Spider-Man related. We're going to stick to live action, so we can't talk about the Spider-Verse stuff as much as I love that. And we're going to stick to the big screen stuff, so we're not going to talk about Nicholas Hammond's made-for-TV movie. Nobody wants to talk about that. But since we're talking about the big screen, this is probably going to be something, I'm not looking at you, Aoibheann, right? That's going to age me. But we're going to start off by asking the key question: who was the first Spider-Man we seen at the cinema? Aoibheann, I'll come to you first. What was the first Spider-Man movie you saw at the cinema, and who was the actor?
Okay, so the first one that I saw in the cinema was the Andrew Garfield, The Amazing Spider-Man film, which I actually got to see it in the Dublin Road Movie House Cinemas, which is now non-existent, which is really sad.
Hashtag gone too soon. So that's a film we're talking about. We're talking about Sam Raimi's 2002 film. Of course, the Mark Webb Amazing Spider-Man is celebrating its 10th anniversary, so let's throw that in there as well. So, Aaron, what about you? Because I can remember very distinctly going to see Tobey Maguire's big screen outing in 2002. I fell in love with it. It's probably one of my favourite comic book movies. This is me putting my cards out there pretty early on. One of my favourite comic book movies probably since the Christopher Reeves Superman movies, and even the Tim Burton Batman. But what was your big screen outing for Spider-Man, and who was the actor?
Well, I'm a little bit older than you, so a bit like you, Jim, my first outing was Sam Raimi's Spider-Man back in 2002, and I remember seeing it. You know, Tobey Maguire at the time for me was completely unknown, but as a 12-year-old boy getting in to watch this, you know, I related to a lot of the things that were in that film. So it was Sam Raimi's Spider-Man I went to see in 2002, and Tobey Maguire will forever be my Spider-Man. Okay,
so that allows us then to segue quite seamlessly in. So what we're going to try and do through this half-hour episode is run through the three actors that have played Spider-Man live action on the big screen, and where better place to start than with Tobey Maguire.
What the hell is that? Whatever it is, somebody has to stop it.
With great power comes great responsibility.
This is my gift.
Wow.
It is my curse.
Who are you?
Who am I? I'm Spider-Man.
You do too much. You're not Superman, you know.
So that's a look at Tobey Maguire in action in Spider-Man back in 2002. Feels like a lifetime ago. Now, Aoibheann, I'm going to come to you first. You came to the Spider-Man films on the big screen through the Andrew Garfield movies. You were depressing both Aaron and I before the recordings, and you kind of remember watching them when you were about 5. I think you'd been about 5 when this was out in the cinema.
Well, I actually didn't get to see it in the cinema. I remember at the time, again, I grew up in a very traditional home where I'm a girl, so I have to like girl things, so I wasn't really introduced to it. But I remember I was over at my cousin, and my cousin was a boy, so he was watching it. And I remember I was sneaking into his room, and he was like the only one in the family. He let me have the boy things, like playing with his wrestling figures and watching Spider-Man. I remember I was watching it, and I was like, I don't like this. This is boring. And now I'm like, I was an idiot. I had no idea that I was in the presence of beauty.
Well, I'm glad you've come to like the films, because, I mean, as I said, I love the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies. And in particular, I actually love Spider-Man 2. I think it's up there as a perfect comic book movie as you're going to get. Probably up there with Richard Donner's cut of Superman 2, but let's not nerd out on those type of things. But where we are with the MCU, without going down that tangent and all the baggage that brings, these films are what led the blueprint for where we are now. Yes, we'd had comic book movies beforehand. You know, we're talking about Raimi's Spider-Man 2002. We've got to mention, okay, let's not talk too much about Bryan Singer, but 2000 with X-Men, maybe even throwing in Blade from 98. Yeah, we also had Batman and Robin in 97, 98. Let's not talk about that. But this is a film, and these three films, maybe less so Spider-Man 3, but we can come back to that, that laid the foundation for where we are with the MCU. Now, Aaron, coming back to you, you mentioned, like me, you saw this was your first big screen experience of Spider-Man. What was it about the Raimi films for you in particular that really nailed the idea of the web slinger and what Stanley and Steve Ditko created? Because it did take some liberties with comic book origins.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, obviously I have a comic shop now. I've been into comics since I was 5 or 6, and it was something. Spider-Man as a character is in the pop culture ethos of everybody. Everybody knows who Spider-Man is. Everybody knows what Spider-Man, how he came to be, what his origin is. But when they released that as a 12-year-old, when I was 12, comics weren't cool. You know, they weren't what they are today. You know, people seen you as a bit of an outcast if you like comics. So when it came to the big screen, it was a moment in time that changed. I think it led the way forward for a lot of different things. Yes, it led the way forward, as you quite rightly say, for blueprints of what was to come film-wise, but I also think it changed the mindset of some people and made some of those characters quite cool. Even, you know, in the film, Tobey Maguire plays the nerdy character very, very well, and you know, it was somebody I related to quite a lot. You know, it was just on the cusp of me getting into first year in secondary school. It was a time in my life when I felt that, you know, things were changing, and that was changing with me, you know. So it was a film that I related to on lots of different levels, and I think that's why I enjoyed it so much at the time. But as you quite rightly say, from being a comic book fan, they did take some liberties from what it was. You know, the suit initially was slightly different. You know, they changed it for the second film, made it a bit more what it should have been, I think. But in terms of the actual meaning behind the character and what the character stood for, I think they nailed what Stanley and Steve Ditko tried to create. You know, they created a character who was going through troubles in his life, was changing through school, but also was trying to fight crime on a street level. And that was the thing that I always took to about Spider-Man. He wasn't always somebody fighting the big superhero-based stuff like Superman, who was fighting off, you know, to save the world. He was fighting crime at a street level, and I felt that the Tobey Maguire film really, really nailed that, you know. So it had a lot of heart, it had a lot of passion, and it was something that, as I say, every time I rewatch it, it still has that rewatchability. And I think that's part and parcel to do with Tobey Maguire, but more importantly for me, it's Sam Raimi. You know, I'm a huge Sam Raimi fan, and you know, it's clear even now, you know, him making Doctor Strange and things like that, the blueprint that he set for Spider-Man was just a moment in time that would change, I think, and help create what's become now.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I am a Sam Raimi fan like you. I maybe don't love the latest Doctor Strange movie as much as you. I don't know where Aoibheann stands on the Doctor Strange movie, but as much as I love Tobey Maguire, and we have Kirsten Dunst as well, we've got some great villains. In the series, we've had William Dafoe as Norman Osborn, we have Alfred Molina, we've had Topher Grace, but we'll not talk about him in Spider-Man 3. But I think that has been a big part of the longevity of those films, particularly in Spider-Man 1 and 2. Yes, William Dafoe's character, he's campy, he's out there, he wouldn't be out of place in something like Batman and Robin. But we'll come back to William Dafoe with the Tom Holland tenure, but for the villains, Aaron, I mean, is that a big part of that film's longevity?
Huge. I mean, Spider-Man villains are a bit like Batman villains, that he's got a huge rogues gallery, essentially, of villains, you know, for Spider-Man. But the thing that Raimi did was pick the right villains for those films. You know, obviously in future films we get to see people like Vulture, and we get to see other villains, Electro, and some of those were done well, not so well, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But what Raimi did perfectly was choose the right villain and also getting the perfect casting. You know, you look at Alfred Molina, he is Doc Ock. You know, he incorporates the very essence of what that character's about, having the scientific background, but also the maniacal side. Perfect. He's got it nailed, and also a lot of heart, which is very important for a lot of the villains in Spider-Man, because one of the things Spider-Man always tries to do is bring them back to their roots and try to get them grounded and sort of turn good again. And I think he tried to do it with Otto Octavius in it. And even when you talk about Willem Dafoe, I think, again, fantastic choice for being the maniacal Green Goblin. But the thing that stands out for all of those films, and even Topher Grace to an extent, was they picked the right villains at the right time. You know, it was a shame that the third one, you know, you had the first one was good, the second one amazing, third one just okay, you know, I guess in the end. The dance scene is, well, I'm not talking about the dance scene, but those films had so much potential and laid the groundwork for what was to come. And I think the villains played a massive part in that, and the casting of those villains.
See, the thing is, Aaron, I love the dance scene in Spider-Man 3, but that says more about me than anything. But I think by the time we get to Spider-Man 3, I think that's 2007, the franchise is starting to be overcooked. We start to see pressure of what studios wanted in. I think the first two, they were seen as less of a risk, but by the time it got to the third film, they were making big money. And of course then Sony want to have more input to make sure that they can get as much money. And they felt that they needed the character Venom. Sam Raimi never wanted to put that character, and I think he said famously he could never find his humanity. And then he gave us Topher Grace's version. Hey, I think he's better than Tom Hardy's Venom, but let's not go down there. But by the time we get to that third film, we have even Sandman in there as well. And coming back to what you said, we see him trying to find heart in that character. And we have a beautiful birthing sequence or creation sequence for Sandman in that film. But Aoibheann, come back to yourself. I know we're rushing through these films, but I think the Maguire era villains have very much defined the live action Spider-Man tenure.
Yep, I honestly feel like Tobey has the best villains out of the three Spider-Men. Cannot fault them for it, besides in the third film, which we all can agree it's not the best. But Willem Dafoe was so iconic as the Green Goblin. All I can think of is the scene of him talking to himself in the mirror was amazing, and I haven't really seen a lot of films previously do that a lot. They have before, but not as well done as this one. It's so iconic to the point where even The Boys in the more recent episodes has made an homage to it, with Homelander talking to himself in the mirror, where one side of the mirror is his like weak self and the other one is strong self, but it's the darker side of him and the more twisted side of him. And it was just really creepy to watch on screen. And then Alfred Molina is just amazing as Doc Ock. I can't see anyone else play him because I personally don't want to see anyone else play him. I love him so much. He's like Wolverine to me. He's like, if anyone else plays him, I will actually be quite upset.
Well, I think we are possibly going to get a new Wolverine.
No,
I think it's
don't
Tyler
say
Edgerton,
that.
I think, is possibly been mentioned. And thank you for the reference to The Boys. I think that's about all we can probably talk about with The Boys pre-Watershed. Look, we've tried to kind of cram in as much about the Tobey Maguire, the original three Tobey Maguire films as we can. We are going to move on. I think we can safe to say the first two films are genre defining in kind of the modern, what we think of the modern comic book movies. There's no getting away from that. The third one is it's flawed. It has its moments that I like. I like the dance sequence. I've already said that. I like the hair. There's things I like about it, but it's overcooked. It's a studio meddling within the series, and I think this is going to be a thread we're going to come back to with the Andrew Garfield film. So with that, let's move on to 2012 and The Amazing Spider-Man.
38 of New York's finest versus one guy in a unitard.
If you want the truth, Peter, come and get it.
I am issuing an arrest warrant for the masked vigilante known as Spider-Man.
I'm in trouble.
So that's a look at Mark Webb's The Amazing Spider-Man. Look, I know Aoibheann's there. She's chomping on the bit to talk about the film, but I'm going to come to you first. So Sony decided to reboot the franchise. Sam Raimi had talked about doing Spider-Man 4. I think he talked about having Vulture and talking about having Black Cat. I think it was Anne Hathaway was cast in that role. Then she went on to be in The Dark Knight Rises. So here we have Sony deciding, reboot the franchise, getting a new actor in to play Spider-Man. And more importantly, I think this is something that I think is an important thing as someone who is a fan of the comic books. And I know you both are too as well. But we have Gwen Stacy, who is a very important character in Spider-Man lore. And it's fair to say both the Tom Holland tenure and the Tobey Maguire tenure, okay, she's kind of brought in Spider-Man 3, but that's a mess of a film. But Aaron, what do we think? And what do we generally think of, we'll kind of cram the two together, the two Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movies.
Well, just to touch on what you said about Gwen Stacy, as class as Mary Jane is, Gwen Stacy is fundamental in the character development of Spider-Man. You know, she's one of those characters that really, really makes Spider-Man who he is and who he becomes. So it was very important that they brought her in at some point in the films properly. And I was delighted to hear when, you know, Andrew Garfield was picked to be Spider-Man because, as you said, he was a comic book fan. He had just come off the back. I think a Social Network was out around the same time. And I knew who he was, and I thought, he's a perfect choice, actually. He's a bit, maybe a wee bit too cool for school is the only thing. You know, Peter Parker in my eyes was always a nerdy, geeky sort of fella. So when they give it to Andrew Garfield, I just thought he might be a wee bit too cool for Spider-Man. But having watched it, the film itself, I think, was just okay. I think he was phenomenal. I think not so much as Peter. As Peter, he was, as I say, he was a bit of a cool cat, which didn't really necessarily work for the character. But as Spider-Man, out of the three, I still think he's the best Spider-Man out of the three. I think he nailed the character of having the real superhero feel about the character. He was, you know, when he was saving people, he had the humour with it. Tobey Maguire's was a little bit more, you know, a wee bit too straight-laced for when he was saving the characters, whereas he has the humour. But he also has the ability to not be overly goofy when he's saving, you know, some of these people. So I thought his Spider-Man was perfect. I think the Peter, as I say, you know, left a wee bit to be desired, but that's more the film's fault, not necessarily Andrew Garfield's. You know, at the time, I was 22, 23 watching it, and because of what had happened with the third Spider-Man, I was a wee bit dubious, but I was looking forward to a reboot. And I think they did okay with the first one. It was okay. I think the suit was crap, and the first one was absolutely ridiculous. I know it sounds, how nerdy is that, you're talking about the suit, but it was important to me because what Tobey Maguire's suit had set up was something very comic book accurate, certainly in the latter stages. The second film, they took that on board. The fans came out and criticised it heavily. And the suit that they made in that second film was perfect. It was Spider-Man. Andrew Garfield was Spider-Man. The problem with those films was the villains weren't great. You know, Electro as a villain had potential. The way they done him dirty in that film. I love Jamie Foxx, but the wrong casting for that, the wrong version of Electro just didn't work. The way they brought him back for No Way Home or Far From Home was ideal. He was actually much better than that. So it goes to show that the films had inherent problems, not the cast, and certainly not the portrayal of those characters.
I've always said I think Andrew Garfield is the perfect Spider-Man, whereas Tobey Maguire for me is the perfect Peter Parker. Yeah. And it probably leads me into the point I'll make about Tom Holland, about kind of bridging those two kind of aspects of the character. Yeah, I have a soft spot for these movies. I don't love them, probably because, coming back to what Aoibheann was mentioning earlier on about with Wolverine, Tobey Maguire was there first, so Tobey Maguire, you know, you're my Spider-Man. You'll always be my Spider-Man. Much as I even love Tom Holland now, he will always be my Spider-Man. But Andrew Garfield came in, and putting it into context, in 2012 we start to see the emergence of the MCU. We start to see that Sony are trying to universe build, and they pretty much did, less so in the first one, but they put the cart before the horse with the second film, where they tried to set up a lot of things. They tried to set up the Sinister Six. They had a lot of things. They have Norman in the background in the first film, and then he's, well, sorry, spoilers, but it's an old film. He is no more in this, in Spider-Man 2. He is deceased. That I thought was a waste, but as flawed and clunky as it is, there's a charm to it, particularly the first one. And I just don't love it. But there's one person in the room who does love the Andrew Garfield films, and that is yourself, Aoibheann. So this is your moment to shine now. I know when we had you on last year, at the beginning of this year, talking about Spider-Man No Way Home, we're going to come back to that film, you talked a little bit about your love for the Garfield films. So here's your chance. I'm going to let you give it all again. Why do you love these films?
All right, let's start. Basically, exactly what you said. I think Andrew is the perfect Spider-Man. Like, as an example of it, the one scene that I love so much is him with the car thief, where he sneaks into the car and he's like playing with him a little bit, like toying with him. And then outside he's like, oh, my one weakness, like small knives. And he's like, just kidding. Like, I just think that's perfect Spider-Man. But then also him, whenever they're on the bridge and he's saving that kid in the car, and then giving him the mask and all that sort of stuff. Again, it's just perfect Spider-Man. Like, I do think he can be a bit too cool for school as Peter, but there's something that I kind of like about it. I don't know, that might just be me and kind of biased, and like those are the kind of guys that I like. But like, I just really like him as a character, but not really so much for Peter. It's the same with Electro. Whenever he first came on as Max, I loved him as Max, but not so much as Electro. And I loved his character, but again, not for Electro. And then Harry Osborn as Green Goblin, like Junior, because it wasn't really a Green Goblin beforehand. Again, it was just weird. Like that whole scene of him like transforming and all, like every time I can't watch it because it hurts my head. Like not even in an epileptic way. It's just too much and not in a good way at all. But there's still so much that I love about the film in kind of like a campy way, but also in a really heartful way. Like I love the relationship between Peter and Gwen. I just think it's amazing, probably also because they were also dating at the time, so it probably helps a little bit more, but just the way how they're even able to show it on screen, I think is amazing. And I just think it's like really cute and wholesome to watch them at times. And like the one scene I always remember is them getting like the ice cream and all, and like the rules because they're not like dating each other. Like it's always just really heartwarming to watch. As much as I love the films, there is a lot to critique, but I think that's what you need to do with the films that you like, is be able to point out what's wrong with them, because not every film's perfect, and that's what's with these ones. But there's so much to them that's iconic to me. Like I said, they were the first ones that I watched in the cinema, and I still remember it was my cousin's birthday. We went to see it, and I was so excited. I was like, this is my first superhero film I'm getting to watch. This is amazing, literally amazing. And then I came back home, and I remember I was trying to recreate. Did you ever get the scene of him playing with his spider powers for the first time, doing the handstands, and then going up onto his fingers, and then going onto his like 2 fingers, and then the one, I was like in my back garden for days trying to do a handstand, let alone trying to do it on just my fingertips. And my mom used to like sit and watch me from her kitchen window and be like, what is this idiot doing? But I was like, I'm Spider-Man, it's great.
I can safely say I've never tried those, and now as I'm nearly 40, I think my time of trying to do those moves has probably passed. Look, as I say, I have a soft spot for the Garfield films. I think they're flawed. I think, coming back to that point, particularly I think it's 2014, Amazing Spider-Man 2, it's a studio trying to react to the MCU. It's like, right, we're going to have the Sinister Six movies. We're going to have all this kind of back catalogue and all this backstory about Peter Parker's parents. It's clunky and you don't need it.
I pretty much agree, yeah. Like, as much as, again, I say I love the films, I feel like there was way too much going on at the same time, that if they just took some bits out, it could have been a much more enjoyable film.
Yeah, and we could have particularly done without Paul Giamatti's terrible Russian accent. But look, that's enough of the Andrew Garfield for now. Let's move on to the final stage of this week's show as we look at the Tom Holland era.
Forget the flying monster guy. There are people who handle this sort of thing.
I'm sick of him treating me like a kid all the time.
But you are a kid.
This is my chance to prove myself.
Peter, what is going on with you?
I'm really sorry. I'm so busy. I'm slammed.
Don't mess with me, because I will kill you and everybody you love.
So that's a look at Tom Holland in action in Spider-Man Homecoming. Yes, I know we can talk about Captain America Civil War, that was his big screen debut, but we're trying to focus on particularly the Spider-Man movies directed by John Watts. Even I'm going to come to you first, because Aaron and I had to go through this. We'd already had to go through this once, where we had got an actor, we had got emotionally engaged, then the studio decides to recast that role. So how did then you approach the Tom Holland era as Spider-Man, and did you need some convincing to be won over?
See, I at first was kind of like, I don't know how I feel about this, but I got introduced to Tom in Captain America Civil War and was like, okay, I really like this guy, this can be interesting. And then heard he was getting his own film, and I was like, oh, well, if he's going to be like the same way Harry was in Civil War, it's going to be great. Watched it, he was not like how he was in Civil War. It was not like it. It was very Iron Man Jr., and that bugged me because kind of like a sin for the MCU. I don't like Iron Man. So whenever his whole character was just Iron Man Jr. through the whole thing, it always bugged me. So that's why like the newest one I really like, because he's finally officially stepping away from that. And maybe we can see Tom being a bit more like comic Spider-Man, but it's just the fact that he was constantly Iron Man Jr. It's bugged me since the first film. He's still a good Spider-Man, but not great.
He's not your Spider-Man?
No, he's not my Spider-Man.
Okay, I guess as
we're going to
come back to this. Right, I think you have hit one of my criticisms of Tom Holland's era. And I like Tom Holland as Spider-Man. I mean, it's a bit like going back many years ago when Michael Keaton was my Batman. And when Christian Bale rocked up, it's like, it's not my Batman. And now I'm very much like, Christian Bale, you're my Batman. You're my Dark Knight. Tom Holland has won me over because I think, coming back to that point I mentioned earlier on, he manages to straddle those two roles of Peter Parker and Spider-Man much more effortlessly than either of the two actors have done. But coming back to the point Aoibheann has made, just to steal her point, the fact that now he's part of the MCU, that we don't have the friendly neighborhood Spider that I guess we definitely got in the early Sam Raimi films, we got in the first Andrew Garfield film, but you know, what about you? Where does Tom Holland rank for you?
No, I agree completely. I think I agree with both of you said there. I mean, the friendly neighborhood aspect of Spider-Man is what I love as the character. He's somebody who's grounded, as always, as we said earlier, street level saving people. With the Tom Holland MCU stuff in general, they've put him front and centre of the cosmos saving environment, and you know, that's not really Spider-Man. They put him with Doctor Strange, they put him with Tony Stark, he's up in space fighting with the Guardians, he's everywhere. And you know, for a 16-year-old kid, it's not really the Spider-Man that I grew up to know and love. But in terms of his casting, when I first heard it was Tom Holland, the first thing I thought was, who's Tom Holland? You know, I'd only really heard of him through his dad's on Mock of the Week. You know, his dad's a famous comedian, and I sort of thought, really? He's going to be Spider-Man? But what they've done each time with the cast of Spider-Man, they've always got it right. You know, for him, again, as you quite rightly say, he bridges the gap which Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, whilst one was good at Peter and one was good at Spider-Man, he's actually very good at both. What he does well in these films is, it's like a fledgling Spider-Man. He's learning his craft and he's honing it in. You know, Garfield then, you know, it's essentially it's stages of Spider-Man in each of them, and you see that with the most recent film. You know, Tom Holland's version is a kid. He's the young fledgling who's, as I say, learning his craft. You then go to Garfield, who's sort of who's got used to it, who's became cool, knows what he's doing, to the sort of senior Tobey Maguire, who really just has fought so much and has lost so much, but he still understands the importance of being Spider-Man. So there's a nice polar transition through them all. But I think the introduction of Tom Holland was perfect. He was the first out of the three of them that was the right sort of age group to play Spider-Man. He was the first that really felt like, you know, the Spider-Man that was seen in the comics from both aspects. So I think the casting was perfect. As you say, some of the films have been really, you know, I've enjoyed them. Anything in the MCU I enjoy it. They're popcorn films for me. I generally come away, even Doctor Strange recently, I come away quite excitable about where they lead to next, because they always set something up. And I think what they've done with Spider-Man, as much as you quite rightly say, Tony Stark Jr. for that first film, I think that was to try to tie him into the MCU, because he was always a distant relative through the Sony world, that they had to pull him in and pull all those characters and make him feel part of what was there. So I think they did it quite well. And as I say, I'm looking forward to seeing, he's going to be front and centre apparently now, pushing the MCU forward. So I'm looking forward to see where they go with it. I just hope that it's more of what we've just recently had with him, having the heart and having the, you know, he understands his role as Spider-Man now a lot more. So, yeah, I say I quite enjoy him. I think out of the three, he bridges that gap better than the other two. But as I say, he's still not necessarily my Spider-Man.
It gave us probably one of my favourite villains in the MCU with Michael Keaton.
Good old Spider-Man.
Not someone who's out to take over the world, not someone who was like a genocidal Bono with Thanos, but we had someone who was just out to kind of make a bit of money for his family. And I love Michael Keaton's Vulture. Yeah, I don't know what they're going to do with the character now that he's supposedly in this kind of new Morpheus, kind of new kind of Spider-Verse. It gets complicated and my head hurts when I start to think about it. But for you, Aoibheann, while you maybe don't love Tom Holland as much as Andrew Garfield, you know, we've just had Spider-Man No Way Home. I think it's fair to say it's been out for a while. Most people know. There's memes, there's GIFs, we can talk about it. I'm sorry, all three Spider-Men are back now, all together on screen. That made my spider sense tingle. I got a bit caught up, we talked about that at the time when we had you on the show. But now that there is that potential to bring Garfield back, to bring Maguire back, would you want to see them back as Spider-Man? I know that Andrew Garfield, it was rumoured for a while, was going to be in Morpheus. Probably he dodged a bullet in that film. But there's now that potential. We now, as Aaron's mentioned a couple of times, the multiverse It's a thing. It's here to stay. Do you think now that we have that potential, do you want to see them go forward with Tom Holland, or do you want to see, as much as you love Andrew Garfield, has the sun set on his tenure, or do you want to see him back?
See, I have a love-hate relationship with that question, because I do want to see him back I would love to see them get a new chance, and especially with Andrew, because he is so good as Spider-Man, for him to be given a better script and another chance and just a better Spider-Man opportunity. But also, I just feel like it's been, 8 years now, like, as much as I would love it to happen, and I will, if it does happen, definitely will be the first person in line to get a ticket to go see it. I just don't think it'd be great. But if they did, I would kind of love to see him as after Gwen has passed away and he's just really down and kind of more of like a nitty-gritty Spider-Man. Kind of him starting to lose his way and realise, no, it's not okay, and come back, because he kind of hinted to that in No Way Home. So I would like to see it, but again, I just don't know if it would be the best idea.
Yeah, look, we talked about it at the time when we had you on the show. I like the fact that Spider-Man No Way Home, it gave that sense of closure for Andrew Garfield's. And I think of the three, yes, there's closure for Tom Holland's character, but of the two returning Spider-Man, I think between Maguire and Garfield, Andrew Garfield's character was given much more to do and was given much more closure. Aaron, same question to yourself. You know, would you want to see? You're someone who loves the multiverse. Your answer to anything is always was, it's the multiverse. Do you want to see Tom Holland kind of pushing forward, or would you be like to see Maguire back for a Spider-Man 4, Andrew Garfield back for Amazing Spider-Man 3?
No. As much as I love those characters, they were at a place and time, not only in my life, but in the world of superheroes. And Tobey Maguire had his day, did very well at it. Garfield got a raw deal, but got nice closure in No Way Home. Those films set the blueprint for what was to come. Tom Holland's done a cracking job at it. And I think to then let somebody come back as Spider-Man and him not to be Spider-Man, it doesn't make any sense. Even in the multiverse, it doesn't make sense. So as much as I love those, some things are better left where they were. If they ever are to do a film with Tobey Maguire or Garfield, or a series, the only way I could see it working is to do something Joker-esque, something completely off kilter, something that follows them when they're much older, because Spider-Man's a kid. Spider-Man's not 40, he's not 50, whatever age Tobey Maguire is now, and Garfield's probably my age or older. I'm too old to play Spider-Man, so if I'm too old, Andrew Garfield's too old to play him now, and unless they do an older version or an older story. So at the minute, Tom Holland, keep pushing with it. Let those other two, they've had their day and they got lovely closure. That film was the perfect way to finish everybody's Spider-Man story. And who knows, we'll maybe get a new Spider-Man.
Who knows, Aaron, we might even get Miles Morales on the big screen. And look, just on that, one final note, if you go away from one thing from this episode, Aaron, you're never too old, my friend, to play Spider-Man. No, if you feel you can still play Spider-Man, if you can get the costume on, I've tried many a time, you can be Spider-Man. Look, I think that's us out of time, because I get a sense. I was going to ask you who would be your definitive Spider-Man. I know what your answers are going to be. Yours is going to be Andrew Garfield. Yours is going to be Tobey Maguire. And I'll just be contrary and I'll say Tom Holland. So there we go. We'll call it a draw. So all that's left for me to do on this Spider-Man special is to thank my two guests this evening. So thank you very much, Aoibheann.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
Thank you, Jim.
More importantly, thanks very much for watching at home. We'll be back next week with another episode. But for now, until then, goodbye.